Hello, everyone. I'm back. And for this session, I'll be speaking with Precious Matsoso, co chair of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body, tasked to draft and negotiate a WHO convention, agreement, or other international instrument on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. Precious, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to listeners, viewers from different parts of the world.
Now, we're here in Geneva, and I think everyone's wondering kind of what's going on with the pandemic accord. So maybe you can start by just giving us an update. What's the status of the work on this instrument, and what progress have you made today?
Well, firstly, let me start by saying since our election in February on the 21st, we've been, we had to roll up our sleeves as a bureau. As you know, as bureau members, we had very tight timelines, and the most important timeline is the discussion that is supposed to take place before the 1st of August. So far, the Bureau has held 10 meetings, and the INB has met twice, both in February as well as in March, and we also held public hearings. And in this period, we had to agree on a method of work, uh, but also determine the type of stakeholders that should form part of this process, because it cannot just be left to member states only. Our view is that stakeholders can make a huge contribution. But of course, there are limitations in that the stakeholders are only those that are in official relations with WHO. But we have extended that in the next meeting of the INB, we will also determine which other stakeholders should form part of this process. We also engaged member states and stakeholders for them to give us input and help identify substantive elements that must be included in this legal instrument. And that process has been quite enlightening in that we allowed member states to give their inputs for a period of 6 weeks. And it's quite clear that 6 weeks was quite tight for some of them, and the response rate for that period was quite low. I mean, we only had about 19% response rate between member states and stakeholders. And we extended that period by another 2 weeks. So, in essence, for the period of 2 months, we allowed inputs for the identification of substantive elements that should be included in the instrument. And I'm glad to say that we have actually had 51% response rate. And of the 51% response rate, we also received 3,000 written inputs from member states. But in addition, because we held public hearings in April, there's been about 36,000 written submissions, which we're busy analyzing. So we're hoping that in June, we will be able to present an outline of what is it that must inform the legal instrument. And secondly, would like also to have a working draft that should be the basis of discussion in July. So that working draft is going to be a very important document. But the approach that we want to follow is to set up subgroups that will draw in experts, civil society, and different stakeholders so that this can be a very inclusive process, but that is technically robust.
You mentioned earlier the next meeting where you're opening it up to others who are not part in official relations with WHO. So, can you just clarify when that is and what timelines are you working on? So, you're mentioning you're hoping there will be a working draft. So, when is that going to be? And you know, I guess the negotiations, when do you expect negotiations to begin?
Well, firstly, on the 6th, from the 6th of the 6th to 8th of June, this is when we'll be inviting more stakeholders. That is, those that are not in official relations. This will be experts, this will be civil society, this will be private sector, different stakeholders who will be part of this process. It is at this meeting where we'll also establish working groups, and these working groups will be in accordance with thematic areas that we'll agree on at that meeting. We're hoping that between June 8th and the beginning of the next sitting of the second INB, would have produced a working draft, would have identified those sections of the Constitution that we're going to be relying on for this instrument. So the meeting of July is going to be a major a deliverable that's going to come out of that meeting. And I think from that meeting, what we'd like to do, because between August and October, there will be different regional committee meetings, would like to take this product that we would have produced in July and start the consultations in those regional committee meetings. And hopefully, beginning of December, that product would be the basis on which we can start negotiations.
You were mentioning earlier the thousands of inputs that you've received from, different, from member states, from non-state actors. What can you give us a sense of what are some of the inputs that you've received that really you found that, oh, this should be definitely part of this instrument?
Well, I think the most important is in relation to the structure. I mean, there are certain principles that applied when legal instruments like this one are developed. And those have to deal with the kind of outline that would like to see. For instance, the objectives, the scope of this instrument, the obligations by member states, and institutional arrangements. I think those are sort of standard provisions, and we wanted to hear from member states and stakeholders what is it that should be included in those, and principles, sort of guiding principles. The third is actually the strategic pillars that should form this instrument, and the manner in which we consulted member states about equity, governance, financing, as well as systems and tools, is the basis on which most member states responded. And I don't want to preempt the report that we're going to share in June, but it's going to be important to note that we've had a resounding kind of support for these elements. For the 51% of member states who responded, it's been incredible.
You've mentioned about equity, and I think we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic how big of a challenge that is. So, how can this accord really be helpful to countries? How are you making sure that, that equity and access to life-saving tools are part of this, will be part of this?
Well, I think it's probably one of the key areas where there's overwhelming support that this element must be incorporated, and this has to do with equitable access to medical countermeasures. It's about equity in terms of participation of different stakeholders, members, vulnerable groups, and those who have been previously disadvantaged. So it's broad, but it also has very specific elements that I think are going to be extremely important for inclusion. And I think member states have already given us an indication that they would love these to be included.
Mhm. One of the things, because there's a parallel process happening, right? There's the international health regulations, and one of the criticisms, or what experts say is lacking in there, is about compliance, um, for member states to follow and others. So, how's that discussion going with the INB in terms of, whatever is going to be part of this instrument, there will be, compliance, that it will be followed.
Well, without preempting the process of negotiations and the inputs, I can only hasten to say that, there are a whole lot of experiences that we can learn from, as INB, and we're going to draw those lessons as part of this process. From other UN agencies, IAEA, for instance, the International Atomic Energy Agency. We're going to also learn from other processes to see what is it that they've put in place that ensure that there's some level of compliance. But of course, we have to look at what is practical, what is doable, and what is it that will get overwhelming support of member states.
Mhm. Can you also talk about sanctions, perhaps? Because, is that something that you're currently discussing within the body?
Well, at this stage, we haven't come to those details. We're still analyzing the inputs to look at what is it that must be contained in the instruments. But those are some of the things that will have to be discussed, perhaps, when we come up with a working draft. And it is the working draft that will give one a sense of what will be contained, what will be excluded. But from the inputs that we've received, it is clear there's a clear message as to what is it that member states would like to see included in the instrument.
But as co-chair, how important do you think that is as part of this instrument?
Well, I think perhaps what we need to do is to look at, what is it that we fail to do, and what is it that we can prevent for the future, and do it in such a way that it will help us not to be in a situation in which we are again. And we can't be counting number of deaths, we can't be counting the collapsed economies of countries and loss of jobs, and women who have been put in worst situations. If we're to prevent this from happening in future, we'll have to come up with the best instrument that will ensure that there's some level of accountability. There's been some proposal for peer review mechanisms. We'll have to learn from the UN human rights, process to say, how did that work? Will it work for these instruments? We have to look at other agencies. How did they do it? And what will be the best implementation process? An instrument alone will not help unless there is implementation.
There's been this sort of narratives going on about these processes sort of impinging on country sovereignty. Can you just maybe comment on that?
Well, I think there's some anxiety by some countries that, this process will undermine their sovereignty. Some think that, there will be certain things imposed on them. But I think, this is a member state led process. And we're hoping that member states themselves are going to weigh options and look at what is it that's best for their individual countries, but what is it that's best for the world? What is it that will help us prevent the spread of disease such that we exposed people to harm? And I think that's a fundamental issue. We've seen what inaction causes. We've seen what lack of sharing of information does. And if we're to find ways to minimize these and prevent these, And if this instrument can help us do that, I think we should.
There are those that are hoping, this work can be accelerated, and there are those that don't expect any sort of decision happening until 2024 or later. What can you say to that? How soon, perhaps, do you see the world agreeing on, a, a convention, a treaty, or agreement, or what they end up agreeing on?
Well, I'm an optimist. I actually see this glass as half full. And because I see it as half full, I think the August meeting is going to be a turning point, because if we can agree on the draft that can be used as a basis of negotiations, that in itself will be a major achievement. And if that will be the outcome, honestly, I don't see why we should extend this to 2024. I firmly believe that it, with all that has happened, we need to speed this process. And August, by August, when we go through these regional consultations until October, it should give us a fair sense of where we are. It will be a litmus test. And in December, we'll be able to say, yes, we think 2024 is too far.
Well, we'll surely be following this process. Thank you so much, Precious. Again, co-chair of the intergovernmental negotiating body to draft and negotiate a pandemic accord.
Thank you for inviting me.